My name is Claire, and before I tell you what happened at my sister's wedding, I need you to understand something about my family. We were the kind of family that cared more about how things looked than how things actually were. My parents, Richard and Diane, had spent 30 years building a certain image in our small Connecticut town: successful, polished, respectable. And there was one person in our family who never fit that picture, no matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she gave. That person was my grandmother, Eleanor. For 22 years, my grandmother cleaned houses for a living. Big houses, mostly the kind with marble countertops and circular driveways, owned by people who barely looked at her when she let herself in with the spare key they'd given her. She scrubbed floors on her knees. She hauled vacuum cleaners up 3 flights of stairs. She came home every night smelling like bleach and lemon polish, with her knuckles cracked and her back aching, and she never once complained. Not to me, anyway. My parents, on the other hand, complained plenty. Not to her face. Behind her back. She could have done something else with her life, my mother used to mutter when Grandma wasn't around. It's embarrassing, Richard. What am I supposed to tell people at the club? What she told people at the club, I later learned, was that my grandmother did some light housekeeping for a few families, just to stay busy. As if Eleanor's decades of backbreaking work were a hobby. As if the money that quietly kept our family afloat during 2 recessions and one very bad business decision by my father wasn't coming, in large part, from a woman on her knees scrubbing someone else's bathroom tile. I want to be clear about something before I go further. My grandmother wasn't some tragic, broken figure. She was sharp. She was funny in this dry, understated way that used to make me laugh until I couldn't breathe. She read constantly thick novels, biographies, anything she could get her hands on from the library. She noticed everything. She remembered everyone's birthday, everyone's favorite meal, everyone's worst day, and how to make it better. She was, without question, the most dignified person I have ever known. My parents were the ones who made her job into something shameful. She never treated it that way herself. So when my sister Vanessa got engaged 3 years ago, and the wedding planning began in earnest, I watched with a familiar dread as my parents started managing the narrative around Grandma Eleanor the way they managed everything else, carefully, strategically, and with an eye toward what the guest list would think. The wedding was going to be enormous. Vanessa was marrying into money, real money, the kind with a family foundation and a summer house in Nantucket. Her fiancé's family, the Whitmores, ran a chain of upscale hotels along the East Coast. My parents had been walking on air since the engagement announcement, practically vibrating with the social possibilities of it all. And somewhere in the middle of the seating charts and the flower arrangements and the endless conversations about whether the aisle runner should be ivory or champagne, my mother pulled me aside in the kitchen one evening. "I need you to understand something about the wedding," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Grandma is coming, obviously. She's family. But I need you to help me make sure certain topics don't come up." "What topics?" "Her job, Claire." My mother said it like the word itself tasted bad. "The Whitmores are going to be there. Judge Whitmore. Senator Cole is on the guest list, for heaven's sake. I am not having anyone ask your grandmother what she does for a living and hear the word housekeeper come out of her mouth." I remember staring at her, waiting for the punchline, except there wasn't one. "She's not ashamed of it," I said slowly. "Why are you?" "I am not ashamed," my mother snapped, too quickly. "I am protecting this family's reputation on the most important day of your sister's life. There's a difference." I didn't think there was a difference. But I was 26 years old, exhausted from years of these arguments going nowhere, and I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. That was my first mistake. I stayed quiet when I should have said something. I want you to remember that, because it matters later. My mother's solution, it turned out, was elegant in the way that cruelty often disguises itself as elegance. She didn't ask Grandma to lie. She simply decided, on Grandma's behalf, what the truth would be. If anyone asked, Eleanor helped manage properties for a few families, or, more simply, she's semi-retired now, She used to do a bit of house cleaning here and there, nothing serious. Vague enough to be technically true. Small enough to disappear into a conversation without anyone asking a follow-up question. My grandmother, when my mother explained this plan to her over the phone, I was in the room. I heard my mother's half of the call, was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that I only found out later because Grandma told me herself, months afterward, sitting at her kitchen table with 2 cups of tea between us. She'd said, "Whatever makes it easier for you, Diane. I just want to see my granddaughter get married." That was Eleanor. She would rather shrink herself than cause a single ripple in someone else's happiness. It took me a long time to understand that this wasn't weakness. It was a kind of strength I didn't have words for yet. The wedding day arrived in early June, warm and golden, the kind of afternoon that looks like it was designed by a movie set decorator. The ceremony was held at an estate outside of Greenwich, all manicured lawns and white tents and string lights that hadn't even been turned on yet but already promised magic once the sun went down. 240 guests. A string quartet. A guest list that read like a regional who's who. Grandma Eleanor arrived in a soft blue dress she'd sewn small alterations into herself, her white hair pinned up the way she always wore it for special occasions. She looked beautiful. She looked, honestly, like exactly what she was, a woman who had lived a long, hard, honest life and had nothing to be embarrassed about. I sat with her during the ceremony. I held her hand when Vanessa walked down the aisle, and I felt her fingers tighten around mine, and I understood that whatever my parents wanted to hide about her, this woman loved us more fiercely and more purely than anyone else in that entire tent. The reception moved fast, the way big weddings do, the toasts, the first dance, the cake, the constant hum of 200 conversations happening at once. I lost track of Grandma for a while, caught up in taking pictures and being pulled from table to table by relatives I hadn't seen in years. It was during the cocktail hour, near the edge of the dance floor, that I first noticed something was wrong. I saw my mother standing with a small cluster of guests, the Whitmores, Judge Whitmore's wife, and a woman I didn't immediately recognize, tall, silver-haired, wearing an understated navy dress that somehow looked more expensive than anything else in the tent. My mother had her hand resting lightly on Grandma's shoulder, the way you'd rest your hand on a piece of furniture you were showing off, and I heard the tail end of the conversation as I walked closer. "And this is my mother, Eleanor. She's semi-retired now. She used to do some light housekeeping, just a few families here and there, nothing serious, really just to keep busy." My mother said it lightly, breezily, the way you'd mention the weather. She said it with a small laugh at the end, the kind of laugh that was meant to close the subject before anyone could linger on it. And that was the moment the silver-haired woman froze. I want you to picture this. The whole tent was moving, waiters with trays, guests laughing, the quartet playing something soft in the background, and this one woman went completely still. Her champagne glass stopped halfway to her lips. Her eyes fixed on my grandmother's face, like she'd just seen a ghost, or maybe like she'd just recognized someone she thought she'd never see again. "Eleanor," the woman said. Her voice cracked slightly. "Eleanor Whitfield?" My grandmother's maiden name. Nobody at that wedding used it. I don't think most of the guests even knew it. My grandmother looked up, confused for half a second, and then something shifted in her face, recognition, disbelief, something almost like fear. "Margaret," she said softly. "Margaret Ashworth." The woman set her glass down on a nearby table with a hand that was visibly trembling. My mother's smile had frozen in place, the polite hostess mask cracking at the edges, because she clearly had no idea what was happening, and neither did I. "Diane," Margaret said, turning to my mother, and her voice had changed completely. It wasn't polite small talk anymore. It had weight to it, gravity, the voice of someone about to say something that mattered. "You called your mother a housekeeper. Just to keep busy." My mother laughed nervously. "Well, I mean, she does help out with a few properties. Do you know who this woman is?" Margaret cut her off, and her voice rose just enough that the small cluster of people nearby went quiet, and then the cluster around that cluster went quiet too, the way silence spreads through a crowd like a current underwater. Do you have any idea? My mother's face went pale. I moved closer, my heart pounding, because I had never in my life seen anyone speak to my mother that way, and I had certainly never seen my mother unable to answer. 23 years ago, Margaret said, and now her eyes were shining, wet. My husband left me with 3 children and no money. No job. No family nearby. I was cleaning houses myself back then, trying to piece together enough work to keep a roof over our heads, and I was terrible at it, and I was drowning. And there was one woman on my crew who saw me falling apart in a stranger's kitchen, crying over a sink full of dishes because I hadn't slept in 2 days and my youngest had an ear infection I couldn't afford to treat. The whole reception had gone quiet now. Even the quartet had stopped playing, the musicians sensing something was happening that mattered more than background music. That woman, Margaret said, her eyes never leaving my grandmother's face, drove me to the emergency room herself. Paid for the visit out of her own pocket, money she absolutely did not have to spare. Watched my other 2 children at her own kitchen table for 3 days while I got back on my feet. And when I told her I didn't know how I was ever going to pay her back, she said, Margaret's voice broke completely now, and she pressed a hand to her mouth for a moment before continuing. She said, "You don't pay kindness back. You pay it forward." And then she taught me everything she knew. How to run a proper cleaning business instead of just scraping by house to house. How to bid a job. How to treat clients so they'd trust you enough to refer you to their friends. She built me a foundation, brick by brick, with her own hands, and she never asked for a single thing in return. Margaret took a step closer to my grandmother, who was standing perfectly still, tears now openly running down her face. That business, Margaret said, became Ashworth Property Services. We now manage residential and commercial cleaning and maintenance contracts across 4 states. 211 employees. And every single one of them is trained under a program built on principles this woman taught me at her kitchen table 23 years ago, when she had absolutely nothing to gain by helping a broken stranger. The tent was silent except for the distant sound of crickets starting up in the fading light. So no, Margaret said, turning back to my mother, and her voice had steadied now, hardened into something sharp and clear. She does not do a bit of light housekeeping to keep busy. Eleanor Whitfield built an empire out of dignity and hard work, and then she gave that knowledge away for free to a stranger who needed it more than she did. I have spent 23 years trying to find a way to thank her properly, and I never could locate her again after she moved. I have told this story at every leadership conference, every training session, every scholarship dinner my company has ever hosted. I tell young women who are drowning exactly like I was that there are people in this world who will pull you out of the water and ask for nothing in return. And I always tell them her name. I looked at my mother. Her face had gone from pale to a deep, mortified red, the color climbing up her neck the way it did when she knew, absolutely knew, that she had been caught in something she couldn't talk her way out of. My father had appeared at some point during Margaret's speech, drawn by the strange silence, and he stood frozen too, his mouth slightly open, no words coming. Margaret walked to my grandmother and took both her hands. "I didn't know you had family in Greenwich," she said, quieter now, just for Eleanor, though everyone could still hear. "I only came today because Vanessa's fiancé's family are longtime clients of ours. We handle 3 of their hotel properties. I never imagined I'd walk into this tent and find you." My grandmother was crying too hard to speak for a moment. When she finally found her voice, it came out small and cracked. "I think about you all the time, Margaret. I always wondered what happened to your girls. They're grown now. My oldest just finished law school. None of that happens without you." I want to tell you that the whole tent burst into applause, that it was a beautiful, cinematic moment of vindication. It wasn't, not right away. What actually happened was quieter and, I think, more honest. There was a long, stunned silence. I saw Judge Whitmore's wife's eyes well up. I saw the caterer pause mid-step with a tray in her hands, unwilling to break the moment by moving through it. I saw my sister, the bride, standing at the edge of the crowd in her wedding dress with her hand pressed over her mouth. And then I saw my mother. She looked, for the first time in my entire life, genuinely small. Not performing smallness for sympathy, the way she sometimes did, actually small, actually exposed. The careful architecture of her image collapsed in front of 240 people, including a state senator and a sitting judge. "Mom," Vanessa said, her voice shaking, walking toward our mother in her wedding dress. "You told everyone Grandma just cleans houses." "Vanessa, You've been telling me that my whole life," Vanessa said, and I realized in that moment that this had never just been about today, that my sister had been carrying the same quiet discomfort I had. The same unspoken understanding that something in our family was deeply unfair, and neither of us had ever said it out loud until this exact moment, in front of everyone. "You made me feel like I should be embarrassed of her. I used to lie to my friends in college and say she was retired from an office job, because that's what you taught me to do. And she built an entire company out of her kindness, and she never told any of us, because she didn't want to embarrass you." My grandmother reached out and touched Vanessa's arm gently. "Sweetheart, this is your day. Please, let's not." "No," Vanessa said, turning to her, gentler now but no less firm. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I'm so sorry we did this to you." My mother tried one more time to smooth things over, her voice pitching high and bright in that way it did when she was performing calm. "I just didn't want people to make assumptions, that's all. I never meant." "You meant exactly what you said," my father interrupted, and this surprised me more than anything else that happened that day, because my father rarely contradicted my mother in public or in private, as far as I knew. He turned to my grandmother, and his voice was rough. "Eleanor, I've known you were remarkable for 30 years, and I let my own vanity keep me from ever saying it out loud. I'm ashamed of myself, not of you. I never should have let this happen." The tears came harder from Grandma then, and this time they weren't the tears of someone being praised in front of a crowd she never asked to be in front of. They were the tears of someone who had spent 22 years believing, quietly, that her worth was measured by her paycheck and her job title, only to discover in the span of 10 minutes that the people who mattered most had known the truth all along and simply hadn't had the courage to say it. Margaret didn't let the moment end there, either. She turned to the crowd, because by now, half the reception had drifted close enough to hear everything, and raised her voice slightly. "I'd like to propose a toast," she said, "if the bride will allow it." Vanessa, tears streaking down her own face now, nodded and gestured for someone to bring Margaret a glass. "To Eleanor Whitfield," Margaret said, lifting her glass, "who taught me that the measure of a person isn't the job they hold, but the way they hold other people up when no one is watching. I hope every person in this tent leaves tonight and calls someone who took care of them when it wasn't convenient and tells them thank you. Don't wait 23 years like I did." 240 glasses rose into the golden evening light. And for the first time in her life, in front of everyone who mattered in my parents' carefully constructed social world, my grandmother wasn't the family secret they managed and minimized. She was the reason half the good things in our lives had ever been possible in the first place. The rest of the wedding didn't go back to normal, exactly, but it went somewhere better than normal. My mother spent the remainder of the evening quieter than I'd ever seen her, and I caught her once, near the dessert table, wiping her eyes when she thought no one was looking. Later that night, after most of the guests had gone, I saw her sit down next to my grandmother at an empty table, and I didn't hear what she said, but I saw her take Grandma's cracked, weathered hands in her own smooth ones and hold them for a long, long time. I won't pretend everything was magically fixed after that night. My mother is still my mother, she still cares more than she probably should about appearances, and old habits don't dissolve in a single emotional evening, no matter how dramatic. But something did change. The next family holiday, when my aunt asked Grandma what she'd been up to, my mother answered before Grandma even opened her mouth. "She built a business empire out of nothing but kindness and hard work," my mother said, and there was pride in her voice this time, real pride, not performance. "She's the most impressive person in this family, and we should have been saying so for years." Margaret and my grandmother reconnected properly after the wedding. They have dinner together every few months now. Margaret's company sponsors a small scholarship fund in Grandma's name for women starting cleaning and home service businesses. Women exactly like Margaret used to be, drowning and unsure if anyone would ever reach out a hand. As for me, I think about that evening under the string lights more than almost any other memory I have. I think about how close we all came to letting my grandmother go through an entire wedding, an entire life, being quietly ashamed of a story that should have made every single one of us proud. I think about how one guest, one moment of recognition, undid 30 years of careful, hurtful pretending. And I think about what my grandmother said to me weeks later, over that cup of tea at her kitchen table, when I finally asked her how she'd felt standing there while Margaret told the whole tent who she really was. "I felt like myself for the first time in a very long time," she said. I'd almost forgotten what that felt like. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. Don't wait for a stranger to walk into a room and remind your family what someone is truly worth. Say it yourself. Say it now. Because the people who quietly hold your family together, who show up, who give without asking for anything back, they deserve to hear the truth about themselves while they're still here to feel it, not as a stunned confession whispered across a wedding tent, but as something you tell them out loud every single day.